Brought to you by MuleSoft, provider of the industry-leading Anypoint platform for APIs.
I'm going to talk to you a little bit about open source. And the reason I'm going to do that is I am the president of the Open Source Initiative. We were formed in 1998 to advocate for and promote open source as a concept and a development methodology. I've done lots of other things as well. I made Java and Solaris open source when I was at Sun Microsystems. I worked for IBM for 10 years. Done all sorts of exciting things. These days, I am either a consultant or unemployed, depending on how you look at it. Most of my time is taken up thinking about open source and digital rights. Now, of course, open source is absolutely everywhere. It's more everywhere than you even imagine that it is. If you're using a Mac, you're using iTunes on your Mac, the servers that they're running iTunes on are running Linux. You'll discover that the back end for pretty much everything that you touch on the internet is running on Linux of some form or another. You may think that you are sitting on Windows running all Microsoft apps, but the back end for many of those apps is running on a Linux server somewhere, using an Apache web server, using an open source framework. Open source is absolutely everywhere. Now, all the same, as cloud computing has cropped up, the visions of the founders of the open source movement, it's these two guys, that's Bill Joy there on the left and Richard Stallman on the right, the visions of those guys have been poo-pooed. People have said, what do we need open source for in the age of cloud? And the reason that we still need it, I'm going to explain, is that these four freedoms remain fundamental to every aspect of computing. Open source is based on promoting and guaranteeing that software developers retain the right to use software for any purpose, to study the source code, to improve it as they wish to, and to share the original or the improved version with anyone that they want to. Those four freedoms are foundational to open source and free software, and I use those terms interchangeably because they actually mean the same thing. They're differentiated merely by a philosophical gloss, but they're the same thing. So in the age of cloud computing, does anyone care about open source? Open source is about free stuff, isn't it? Open source is about getting LibreOffice and Ubuntu, and what does it matter about for the age of the internet, the API economy, and the Internet of Things? Well, just for cloud computing, I'd suggest to you that open source is fundamental, and that cloud computing couldn't happen without open source. If you want to have a piece of cloud infrastructure, it needs to be able to automatically scale based on demand, to distribute load, to instantiate new environments every time something happens in the user base. And for that to happen, the last thing you want is to have to track license usage. If you had to track licenses and permissions every time you span up a new operating system environment and a new virtual machine, you would quickly either run out of money at peak load, and by the way, it would be a great way to put you out of business to saturate your servers with demand for new virtual machines to be spun up, or you would have to have a relationship with a proprietary vendor that was so close and tight that you wouldn't be able to be a profitable company. So cloud computing utterly depends on open source. All parts of almost every cloud infrastructure are open source software. What makes them proprietary is not the software that they're running, but the know-how, the DevOps that keeps them running. That is really what the world of cloud computing is about. It's about clever DevOps weaving together open source software. But I'm going to suggest to you that the API economy also needs open source. The meaning of business has gradually changed over time. In the industrial age, we moved from the previous era of direct trading in markets into a world of distribution and control points. The Industrial Revolution was all about identifying production, distribution, and economic control points, and then using them, leveraging them, to create wealth. That's the whole system of the industrial era. That's what capitalism is all about, is about identifying control points and leveraging them to create wealth. But the introduction of the internet has broken that model, because increasingly the distribution of goods, access to finance, access to information is available on a peer-to-peer basis across the internet. It's something that's democratized. It's something that's distributed. It's something where people route around control points and treat them as damage. And as a consequence, the nature of business is incrementally changing as we move into the meshed society, as we move out of the society of control points and into the meshed society. And the API economy is an expression of that meshed society. It's how computer software is able to operate autonomously in the meshed society. So we've moved from a hub and spoke topology of business, where people centrally control the means of funding, the means of production, the means of distribution, and we've moved away into a world where corporations are not really trusted anymore. Brian Cantrell pointed out that it's very unwise to treat any corporation as safe. It's just like, he says that it's just like dealing with a lawnmower. You don't put your hand in a lawnmower, not because it's malign, but because it's for cutting things. And if you put your hand in, it will cut your hand off. And similarly, you can expect any corporation, sooner or later, to behave in a way that harms you. In the world of hierarchy and control points, there was nothing you could do about that. And so you triaged it with insurance of risk. You triaged it by the accumulation of wealth to offset harm when it arose. But in the meshed society, you don't have to put up with control points, and you don't have to tolerate the risk of a corporation deciding to monetize instead of serve you. And this is the reason why we need open source in the Internet of Things. So, just to drill in on what open source is all about. Open source is about pre-licensing of rights. Now, the industrial society had a lot of control points, built systems of law that went with the control points based around copyrights, trademarks, and patents. I'll leave you to work out the acronym there, by the way. These copyrights, trademarks, and patents became the way that control points were controlled. But in a meshed society, those different control points need to be dealt with differently. Now, if you're from a vendor, this means that you need to resist the temptation to control your customers. And if you are from a consumer of IT and technology and cloud services, this means that you have to insist that your suppliers don't try to control you. Because the rules have changed. The old rules don't apply anymore. We have a lake where the fire used to be. Control points are now treated as damage because we are in the meshed society. And it turns out that today's challenges require collaboration rather than hierarchies. So now, the next question we have to ask is, what is a community in the open source sense? A community is made up of independently motivated individuals. Here's a monarch butterfly. This monarch butterfly is in California. You can see lots of monarch butterflies in California. Round about this time of year, the monarch butterflies are returning to California from Central America, and they are beginning to form clusters around resources. And that's what open source developers do as well. Open source developers cluster around a resource. They don't do so because they have some philanthropy that they need to respond to, or because they want to make the world a better place. They cluster around the resource because it's in their interests to do so. And that's what these monarch butterflies do. They begin to gather and cluster around trees. They begin to gather together for their own bodily warmth, and eventually they spend the winter in huge colonies of sleeping butterflies. I can tell you where to see these if you want to go and see them in California, in Santa Cruz, in the Central Coast. And open source allows self-interested individuals to come together, to cluster together around the resources that they need to do things. So open source communities are not actually about altruism. They're about altruism without sacrifice because they're serving their own needs. It's not, open source communities aren't about the ownership of code, they're about the making available of code. And open source communities resist control and yet order themselves based on the interests of the participants. And if you are going to make all of these things happen, you need to use open source licenses. Now, what are open source licenses there for? Open source licenses are copyright licenses. Whenever you create any work, whenever you create any software, you automatically own the copyright to that work that you created under the law of pretty much every country. And if you don't have a license from the creator of a piece of code, then you're actually breaking the law if you use it. It's easy in the world of GitHub to believe that if it's published, it must be okay to use it. But that's not true. If a piece of code is published, unless there is an explicit license telling you that you may use the code, you may not use it. You may not copy it, because if you do, you'll be in breach of copyright. And one day, somebody will come after you. It happened to SAP when they bought TomorrowSoft. Oracle came collecting over $1 billion from them for breach of copyright for what previously had been a gentleman's agreement to use educational materials. And it could happen to you too. You shouldn't use any source code to which you don't have a license. Now, how do you get a license? Well, you can pay for a license, but the license you get will be a license that you have to study and negotiate one-to-one. You'll have to get a lawyer involved or a business manager. What you really need is some sort of standardized copyright license that you can rely on, that you know will give you the rights you need to be a developer. You need that license given to you in advance so you don't have to buy it. You need that license to maybe have some sort of certification with it to tell you that it's going to give you the rights you need to develop your software and to distribute it to your customers. And that's what open source licenses are. Open source licenses are standardized, pre-scrutinized copyright licenses that deliver to developers all of the rights that they need to develop software, to change it, and to give it to anyone that they wish to do that with. Now, that used to be important in the age of the desktop, but it's even more important in the age of the API. In an average piece of software, you're using many libraries, many APIs, many web services, and in every case, you will want to make sure you have the rights to be using what you're using. You'll want to make sure that there's a Creative Commons license on the data you're consuming, and you'll want to make sure that there's an open source license on any code that you're using. And if those aren't present, you need to have a business manager crawling through all the paperwork to make sure and find out what the restrictions are on the works that you're creating. Open source licenses create a permissionless environment. That's to say, they create an environment where you don't have to go seek permission to innovate, where you don't have to go and ask someone if you may use their API or their data or their code. Permission has been given in advance through the use of a pre-scrutinized, pre-approved license, and you're then free to innovate. This is exactly what's needed in an API economy. The pre-authorization of any realistic use of the code and the data that's associated with it. That delivers the flexibility that you need to build deployable solutions. Solutions that aren't going to need license management, solutions which are not going to need special terms in the end-user license agreements, and which are going to be resistant against the invasion of your supplier's business models into your business model. They also deliver the freedom to leave. What do I mean by the freedom to leave? Well, recently, an Internet of Things vendor in the UK called Berg has been working on an API and a little printer that distributes work using push technology. Unfortunately, Berg found that they couldn't create a productive, profitable business, and a few weeks ago they put up a web post saying that they were going out of business. All the people who had used their little printer and who had used their API were left struggling, working out what to do next. And the question you have to ask yourself is, well, what are you going to do when your vendor goes out of business? Or what are you going to do when your vendor gets acquired by a large corporation that doesn't need their product? I used to work for Sun Microsystems, and amongst many things we made Solaris and Java, and we also made an identity management suite. And when Oracle bought Sun, they didn't need our identity management suite because they already had one. They simply walked away from it. Fortunately, the large customers who were using it were protected because I'd open sourced the identity management software while I was at Sun, and another company was able to come along, pick up the source code, and continue developing it and providing the service to the customers. Open source acted as a kind of an escrow or as a kind of a guarantee of continuity. And today, very large customers are continuing with another company who are delivering service, support, and development on the same code base. Now, is that going to happen with your IoT vendors? Is that going to happen with your API suppliers? Are they going to protect you against what happens when they exit? There's 3 reasons why they could exit, I think. They could fail. They could be acquired by a company that doesn't need their product. Or they could evolve into something that has a different business strategy. In all 3 cases, you've got a problem if they haven't made their source code open source and their APIs licensed and data licensed under Creative Commons licenses. In other words, when you go in, you've got to ask, do I have the freedom to leave? If I have the freedom to leave, then it's safe to stay. But you should never go into deployment with software where you don't have the freedom to leave or the money to pay to get yourself out. Let's talk about those open source licenses then. Eben Moglen, who's a great thinker about open source licenses, said that licenses are constitutions of communities, and they should most directly be considered to be an expression of the way that the developers working on a particular open source project have agreed to collaborate with each other. The open source license creates the permissionless space in which the developers are able to work with each other, and it reflects the norms and expectations of the developers who are involved. So when you're looking at an open source license, really the first thing to ask is which community is it for and what are their norms and expectations. Now, having done that, it's then safe to go on and try and classify open source licenses. And I've devised a three-phase classification for open source licenses. The more you know about open source licenses, the worse you realize this diagram is. And this is a very poor analysis of open source licenses, but it's really handy. So let me tell you about it. Some open source licenses only involve you sharing the rights to the code, sharing the copyright. And they don't make any other requirements on the derivatives that you make with the source code. Some licenses want to ask you to make sure that everything you derive from the source code is going to also be open source. And those are called project scope copyleft licenses. And in between those two, there's a class of licenses that want to make sure you contribute to the community if you change the community's code, but don't want to place any restrictions on what you do with their code in your own code. Those are called file-scoped copyleft licenses. Historically, these have been called rights-only or permissive. They've been called permissive, weak copyleft, and strong copyleft. But I don't think those terms are very safe to use because they give you the wrong impression about the nature of the license. So rights-only licenses, licenses like the BSD license, the MIT license, and the Apache license, they have clauses in them that are about attribution and trademarks and also about patents if they're any good, but they don't have any requirement that you provide the source code to derivatives that you make from what they're working on. You'll find a lot of vendors in the API space are using BSD license. The reason they're doing that is to have the minimum impact on their users when it comes to licensing, but as I'll explain in a minute, that may open you to some risk. Then the file-scoped copyleft licenses, that's licenses like the Mozilla license, CDDL, the Eclipse public license, and others. Those similarly have attribution, trademark, and patent clauses, but they do have a clause that requires you to provide the source code of derivatives that you make, and that clause is triggered by your derivative changing one of the files in the original work. So that means that if you want to use code that's under one of these licenses, as long as you don't mess with the code that's under one of these licenses, you can license your product under any license you want to. So lots of companies use these licenses, particularly in the Eclipse space. The Eclipse license is one of these licenses, and the license for Solaris is one of these licenses, and the license for Java EE is one of these licenses. And then there's file-scoped copyleft. This also has got the expected attribution, trademark, and patent clauses. It also is only granted to you if you provide the source code to your derived works. But the trigger for providing the source code to your derived works is the distribution of any derived work that originates from this code. So in other words, if you use GPL v3 or AGPL or EUPL code in your product, you have to make sure that you provide the full source of your product to anyone who receives the binary. And for that reason, a lot of companies are very cautious about using GPL licensed code in commercial works. There's no reason you have to be, because in most cases, your customers are trading with you not because of the license of your source code, but because of the skills of your staff. But nonetheless, you'll find that it's very common for people to be very cautious about these file-scoped copyleft licenses. Just for completeness, there is a special case of LGPL. LGPL lies between the yellow and the red blobs, and if you're interested in it, you can ask me afterwards. Now, all of those licenses deal with another bane of the distributed economy, and that is software patents. There are a number of things that are described as intellectual monopolies, or if you will, intellectual property. Copyright is one of them, which we've already discussed. Trade secrets is another. Trademarks is another. In each of those cases, it's pretty easy to tell when you've infringed somebody's rights. You can only infringe copyright if you copy somebody else's work. You can only infringe a trade secret if a secret you've been told gets disclosed to somebody you shouldn't tell. You can only infringe a trademark if you use the trademark without a license. But you can infringe a patent without ever knowing it existed. In fact, software is so prevalent in today's society that I guarantee you the software you're writing every day is infringing someone's patents. It's just a matter of time before the grim IP reaper catches up with you and swings his scythe through your salary and employment. So what do we do about software patents? This is particularly important in the API economy, because in the API economy, you can find yourself using services that are not visible in the API. And you can discover that your actions are infringing somebody's copyrights even without you writing any code, simply a result of a library that you linked or a service you called. So it's very important to get a defense against software patents, and one of the great ways to do that is through open source licenses. Modern open source licenses include a patent peace clause. That patent peace clause will grant you a license to any of the patents of the software authors. And that will mean that you have licenses to a set of patents with which you can defend yourself if you get attacked. And you're also part of a community of people who want to defend the software against the actions of aggressors. The defense against software patents through open source licenses isn't going to stop patent trolls from getting you, but it is going to prevent ordinary competitive attacks from other vendors in your space. And it's extremely useful to have this patent protection derived as a result of the open source license. The alternative using proprietary licensing is to be given an indemnity by the vendor. But in order to collect on the indemnity from the vendor has got to still be in business, and the vendor has got to be motivated to defend you. And on the internet today, vendors are often not in the same country as you. They are often based, their headquarters are often in countries where they can quite safely not deliver on the responsibility to indemnify if there's a big problem. So I believe that you're best defended through open source licenses. I think it's far safer to use open source licensed code than it is to use proprietary licensed code. Just to give you an idea of what we mean by a patent clause, this is the one from the Apache software license. And you'll see that this is a fascinating reciprocal license. Anybody who decides they're going to attack an Apache software license user loses all of their licenses to the Apache software that they're using. So, and as everybody is using Apache software somewhere in their business, this is a dire threat. So you'll find that the clauses in other licenses are different to this. You'll need to get advice if you want to really understand them. It's very important to use modern open source licenses. The old licenses like the BSD license and the MIT license contain no explicit patent licenses. There is a legal theory that suggests you may have an implied patent license under these licenses, but if you want to actually be sure that somebody has given you permission to use the patents associated with the software that you're deploying, you should use a license like Apache or Eclipse or GPL that has proper rock-solid patent language in it that gives you the rights you need. One of the things that we need to therefore consider is how do we understand the liberties that come with open source? You see, open source is often thought of as a simple commercial matter, as a simple matter of saving money on software licenses. But this view of the Statue of Liberty from Manhattan shows that there is a difference between liberty and commerce. The dock cranes think that they have the same posture as liberty, but we can all tell that liberty and commerce are different things in that photograph. Open source licenses deliver for us the liberties that we need. Those liberties exist for really good reasons of commerce. Open source licensing is not simply a philosophy. It is not simply the passion of hobbyists. Open source software is a fundamental aspect of your business relationship with other businesses. I suggest to you that the Internet of Things and the API economy need open source more than ever before. The fact that you're not using desktop software that's under an open source license, or the fact that you're not having to pay the payment of license fees isn't a consideration in using many of these things, doesn't change your need for open source, because open source creates the ground for communities to exist without needing to seek permission for every step of innovation they take. The free licensing of rights in advance is the key enabler for an Internet of Things economy. Open source licenses give licensing to the rights that you need to build your solutions without you needing to hire a lawyer, without you needing to research the grounds of the license. You know that if it's an OSI-approved license, that it delivers the 4 freedoms, and that if it delivers the 4 freedoms, you can do what you wish with the software and give it to anyone you want. And that's by far the most important lubricant to your development of Internet of Things and API software. Modern licenses in the open source space protect as well as enable. They come with patent clauses that protect you from aggression. And open source gives you the freedom to leave. It means that when your supplier finally exits, when their VC calls in the money or cashes in by selling to a large company, you're protected because the source code and the APIs are available for somebody else to continue with. And you haven't been locked out by being locked in. So I suggest to you that the API economy needs open source flexibility more than the desktop economy or the server economy did. And I'm suggesting that you ask your vendors, you ask your CIOs, you ask your architects to simply refuse to deploy without open source. Thank you very much.
Brought to you by MuleSoft, provider of the industry-leading Anypoint platform for APIs.